Good afternoon. My name is Isabel Rohr. I'm the Deputy Director of the JDC Archives, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar, which is made possible by the generous support of the Miriam, Mimi, Tobin Public Educational Programming from the JDC Archives. Let me start by saying a few words for those of you who are not that familiar with the JDC Archives. Our archives holds the records of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, also known as the JDC, since its foundation over 100 years ago. Scholars from around the world, as well as family researchers, filmmakers, journalists, and others, use our very rich collections for their research. We also offer fellowships to enable scholars to conduct research in our archives. And one of these fellowships is the Nathan and Sarah Chassin JDC Archives Fellowship, which was established thanks to a very generous gift from Sorrel and Lauren Chassin to honor Sorrel's grandparents. I'd like to thank Sorrel and Lauren Chassin, who are with us today, for their generosity in endowing this fellowship. Sorrel Chassin will actually introduce our speaker today, Elena Hoffenberg, who received the fellowship for 2024. After Sorrel Chassin's introduction, Elena will give a lecture that will last about 40 to 45 minutes. This will be followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. Please note that your microphones are muted, but that you can send us questions at any time during and after the lecture. Please note also that the lecture is recorded. If you miss any section of it, it will be available in 2-3 weeks on our website. Sorrel Chassin will now introduce Elena Hoffenberg.
Elena Hoffenberg is a doctoral candidate in modern Jewish history at the University of Chicago. She received a master's degree in Holocaust studies from the University of Haifa in Israel and a master's degree, library and information science, with a focus on archival management from Simmons University. Her work has been supported by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. She is the recipient of the Nathan and Sarah Chassin JDC Archives Fellowship. The title of her lecture today is The Respectable Breadwinner, the Frugal Homemaker, and Their Prudent Children, Family and Credit in Interwar Poland. Elena Hoffenberg will now start her lecture.
Thank you very much, Sorrel, for the kind introduction. Please give me a moment to share my presentation. Hello, good afternoon to those of you in the Eastern time zone and further east, and good morning to those of you here in Chicago, where I'm speaking to you from, and further west. Before I begin my research presentation, I would like to thank Sorrel again for the kind introduction and for supporting the study of Jewish history. I was honored to receive the Nathan and Sarah Chassin JDC Archives Fellowship for 2024, which allowed me to conduct the research I will present today. I would also like to thank Isabel Rohr and Abra Cohen for supporting this research and for facilitating today's virtual lecture. To start, I would like to share with you an image that piqued my curiosity and prompted the questions I seek to answer in my work on credit and Jewish economic life in interwar Poland. This photo depicts a national conference of the Union of Jewish Cooperative Societies in Poland, held in Warsaw in the 1920s. I encountered this photo in the personal papers of Moshe Moski, a communal leader from Baranowice, which is today in Belarus, but in the interwar period was in Poland, and he attended this conference as a representative of his local credit cooperative. As a historian of Polish Jewry in the interwar period, I had seen many photos like this one of national or regional gatherings for political and cultural organizations. These photos almost always have at least one woman. I was also familiar with scholarship on Jewish women in Eastern Europe, which emphasizes that Jewish women held a relatively larger role outside the home in economics. And this may sound trite, but I looked at this photo and I thought, where are the women? It's a classic task of women's history to find women in the record of the past, but delving into the sources produced by and about this union of Jewish credit cooperative societies led me to questions more common to the history of gender as a whole. Understanding how gender difference is represented in specific societies and specific times, and better understanding how gender shapes areas of life that do not seem to be directly connected to it. In this presentation, I will explore the question of how gender shaped formal practices of credit, borrowing, and lending among the Jews of interwar Poland. I will spend time with each of the figures from the title of my talk, the Respectable Breadwinner, the Frugal Homemaker, and their Prudent children, to answer the question at the core of my talk today of how gender shaped the provision of credit among the Jews of interwar Poland. This work is drawn from a chapter of my dissertation that presents credit cooperatives as a locus for thought about the Jewish future in Poland in economic terms. In this chapter, I explore the gap between hopes for economic reorganization and the realized potential for securing a Jewish future in Poland, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, uncertainties of changing conditions under capitalism. Being able to delve deeply into the sources of the JDC with support of this fellowship has allowed me to incorporate a different kind of credit institution, free loan societies, many of which were largely supported by the JDC, into this work. By looking at JDC support for the provision of loans to Jews in interwar Poland, we can see that restructuring Jewish economic life relied on reifying or changing the Jewish family. Although this talk has been framed as tracing changes in these distinct roles, the breadmaker, homemaker, and children, what's most important in this process of reconstruction was the relationship among family members. And as I plan to show during this talk, the emphasis on gender, proper conduct, and household or family transformation was a key way that this project of reconstruction distinguished itself from, to use the phrase of the time, demoralizing philanthropy. So I would like to begin by introducing you to the community that I study, the Jews of interwar Poland. When the Second Polish Republic was established in 1918, it brought together lands that had previously been under the rule of Prussia, Russia, and Austria-Hungary. The Eastern Front during the First World War had stretched along this territory, leading to destruction and displacement that in part provided an impetus for the formation of the American Joint Distribution Committee during the war itself. My talk today does not focus on JDC's wartime or early post-war lending efforts, but rather on the regularization of aid and the transition from relief to reconstruction starting in the mid-1920s. A small portion of Poland's 3 million Jews, about 10% of the total population of the country, could be found in the former Prussian territories or in rural areas. The vast majority of these 3 million lived in cities and towns in the former Russian and Austro-Hungarian parts of Poland. In large cities, Jews often made up a quarter or a third of the population, but when we move to provincial capital cities and towns, from which many of the examples of credit cooperatives and free loan societies are drawn, Jews often comprised a majority. Given the close ties between urban life and commerce and the disproportionate presence of Jews in cities and towns, it should not be a surprise that Polish Jews concentrated in trade. In Poland, Jews made up only 10% of the general population, but more than half of the population who earned a living from trade. 1 in 3 Polish Jews were reliant on trade for their livelihood, and 3/4 of these people had no paid employees. I should note that this is not to say that they worked alone. Rather, there were family members, most of all wives and children, who were called upon to fulfill roles in the family business as well as at home. I'd like to take a moment to define some of the terms that I use to describe the institutions where people like the 1 in 3 Polish Jews relying on trade for their livelihood could get loans in interwar Poland. Spółdzielnie kredytowe, casas, or credit kooperativen, which I will refer to in English as credit cooperatives, were financial institutions created on a cooperative rather than profit-seeking basis, with the purpose of granting loans to members. Such cooperatives were organized by Jews in Eastern Europe before the First World War as well, but these institutions grew quickly in the interwar period. These credit cooperatives belong to organizations that publish journals in Polish and in Yiddish, such as Przegląd Spożywczy and Faden Folk, which are pictured here. On the other hand, there were Kasy bezprocentowe pożyczek, or gmilskasodem casas, which I will refer to in English as free loan societies, And these were philanthropic institutions designed to offer very small loans with little or more often no interest. Although practices of charitable loan making have their roots in Jewish tradition, the formalization of these practices through organizations on this scale was new in the interwar period, and it should be noted, unimaginable without JDC support. These free loan societies belong to organizations that publish journals in Polish and Yiddish as well, such as Bulletin Bezprocetowe Pożyczek w Polsce and Volkshilfe, both of which are pictured here. Both types of these institutions could be found throughout Poland in the interwar period. In 1933, there were 748 Jewish credit cooperatives with almost 250,000 members. A contemporary commentator concluded, however, that a third of the Jewish population in Poland, meaning more than 1 million people, benefited from membership in one of these credit cooperatives, since, as this commentator reasoned, each member of the credit cooperative had a family of at least 5 to support. From 1924 through October 25th, 1936, the American Joint Reconstruction Foundation, an institution funded by JDC and by ORT, another economic reconstruction organization serving the Jews in Eastern Europe, contributed more than $4.3 million to these credit cooperatives. In the same year, 1933, there were also 676 free loan societies that made 135,000 loans with an average size of 79 zloty, the equivalent of $16 at the time. These societies were largely reliant on the JDC, which both allocated its own funds and served as a channel for American Jews to send their money to hometowns in Poland. To a certain degree, these institutions were very similar. And during the time period that I studied, the interwar period, representatives of these institutions noted similarity. A resolution passed by the Conference of Free Loan Society representatives in Warsaw in late 1928 encouraged the societies in cities where there were no cooperative banks to take on some of the functions of cooperative banks, namely accepting deposits. In 1933, on the other hand, an activist from a local credit cooperative in Poland's eastern region published a call to establish free loan divisions within credit cooperatives in cities without a free loan society. These offices would serve members of the cooperative who had become so poor that they could not repay their loans, but as the author acknowledged, this would contradict the cooperative ideal they sought to embody. There were also significant ways in which these institutions differed, most of all around credit. The credit cooperatives charged borrowers interest rates as high as 12% annually, and this was in no small part because of the indirect funding structure that the JDC introduced. Money from the JDC traveled from North America to a central bank in Warsaw and then to regional banks before those regional banks provided funds to the cooperatives themselves, and then the cooperatives themselves provided loans to their members. At each step in this journey, interest rates were applied to the capital in order to cover administrative expenses and to cover the risk of non-repayment of loans. The difference between these two types of institution was also important to the free loan societies. In July 1929, the director of the JDC in Poland, Jacek Gitterman, published a circular instructing the administration of free loan societies in their localities to change their statutes, quote, in order to underscore that the free loan societies have the character of a benevolent institution and to address any doubt that the funds are financial institutions. Scholars such as Yehuda Bauer, Jacqueline Granick, and Nahum Karlinski emphasize the dependence of these credit institutions on foreign capital, drawing on the archives of JDC and the American Joint Reconstruction Foundation to understand this activity within the framework of transnational Jewish philanthropy. Work on Jewish cooperatives by Piotr Kędzorek and Moshe Usoskin focus, on the other hand, on ideological influences from Zionism and socialism on Jewish cooperatives. I take my inspiration from other types of works by anthropologists, sociologists, and historians who look to formal and informal credit practices to better understand how the economy is shaped by and shapes kinship, gender, and community. By looking at these credit cooperatives and free loan societies in interwar Poland, I seek to better understand how these institutions deployed culture and economic change, how gender, family, and age were shaped by practices of and ideas about credit for Jews in Poland between the First and Second World Wars. And as I will show in the following sections on breadwinners, homemakers, and children, the emphasis on gender, proper conduct, and household or family transformation is an important way in which these loans sought to embody reconstruction rather than demoralizing philanthropy. I should note that although my study focuses on Poland as the site of the largest Jewish community in Europe before the Second World War, and the largest network of both credit cooperatives and free loan societies serving that community, this work, I hope, serves as an invitation to scholars who work in any of the places pictured on this map where the JDC supported other loan operations, as well as comparisons to loan-based relief and reconstruction in other times and places carried out by other institutions entirely. So first up, are respectable breadwinners. When the Union of Jewish Cooperative Societies in Poland published its account of the economic situation in 1926, it sought to promote its own model for improving the lives of Poland's 3 million Jews, namely the credit cooperative. When choosing figures to represent the membership of these institutions, the editor of this volume foregrounded the individual man. These men, seen below underneath the map of Poland, stand in various postures with various lengths of coat or forms of headwear, but they are dressed in the uniform of the proprietor and, as this section will explore, imagined to stand not only for the business that they run, but also for the family that they have. This iconography serves as an emblem for the numerous references to members as men, brothers, and fathers that can be found throughout the cooperative movement press in Yiddish and Polish. These respectable breadwinners are the implied members of credit cooperatives where they are presumed to be male, and even free loan societies where borrowers were not presumed to be male but still identified as breadwinners. The regulations and practices of these credit institutions crystallized the breadwinner as member and representative of the family's interests. Credit cooperative members were encouraged to open savings accounts in the names of their wives and children, solidifying them as the conduit for access to credit. The statutes of free loan societies often indicated that only one family member could receive a loan, cementing the model of a single earner in the family, even if doing so without explicitly gendered language. In the administration of credit cooperatives, family ties or familiarity was sometimes seen as an obstacle to proper cooperative work. In 1927, Alexander Birkenheim, a leader of the Jewish cooperative movement in Poland, published an article, which you can see on the left, denouncing cooperatives established by, quote, single wealthy men whose livelihood comes from lending money, and close quote, by appointing their relatives and close friends. Birkenheim described these as family cooperatives, or better yet, called false cooperatives, that unsettle and threaten the normal development of the true cooperative banks. In a platform for reforming the credit cooperatives from 1934, the document which you can see on the right, the Union of Jewish Cooperative Societies highlighted the problem of the predominance of one family or another within an institution. Quote, members cannot be fictitious. There cannot be a predominance of one or more families among the members. It should be noted that this concern for mixing family and loans was a practical and not just principled concern. One local activist from the town of Markuszów near Lublin, where there were approximately 2,000 Jews, wrote a brief proposal for nominating rather than electing the officials of local credit cooperatives. This activist suggested that this would help officials avoid the concern about upsetting people with their decisions, which, as he explained, was important, quote, especially in a small shtetl where everyone is related to one another. The differences between credit cooperatives and free loan societies in terms of the model borrower come into starkest relief when we imagine ourselves in the offices of these institutions. This is all too hard to do because the documentary record provides only spotty insights into the everyday workings of these credit cooperatives. The contemporary press published reports on the formation and dissolution of credit cooperatives, and reports and inspections submitted to the Cooperative Council in Warsaw reflected annual operations. Which is why I was so excited to find these photographs, which were taken of a man waiting for a loan at a credit cooperative in Warsaw. His posture, his bearing, suggest an individual patiently awaiting the appearance or return of a bank employee who would hold his future in their hands. If his beard and head covering suggest a man of traditional religiosity, his overcoat confirms that this was a man of some means who has come to ensure that his business can continue or even grow. Importantly, he appears alone in the bank office, and waits patiently behind the waist-high swinging door that separates the employee's work area from the area for customers. The next set of images come from a JDC report about free loan societies from their establishment in 1926 through the mid-1930s. These show crowded spaces with many people awaiting decisions about their loans. In the upper photo, the contrast between the dress, facial hair, and head coverings of the male employee of the Free Loan Society and the majority of the men seeking loans suggests a difference of age, religiosity, and education, or at least type of education, in addition to the clear difference in the work that they do. I should also note that there are women employees of the Free Loan Society pictured here, performing clerical work alongside their male colleague. The presence of women in line waiting for loans in the bottom photo confirms what I want to emphasize next, that it is not only the male breadwinner who benefited from loans, although that may have been the model member for credit cooperatives, but women making use of these institutions still appealed to this model to secure access to credit. An account by the journalist and sociologist Yankiv Lishchinsky offers a glimpse into what might have been said in such firms where people made the case for receiving a loan. In an article written after his visit to a loan office in the city of Lvov in 1930, Lishchinsky recounted what a small, thin woman with a large shawl covering her eyes said to the committee considering loan requests. "Jews, you are merciful sons of the merciful. Will you then allow a poor widow to fall into the netherworld? Jews, a poor person like me is as good as dead, but I am not yet dead, and my 4 children also do not want to die. They eat and peck, and when there is no bread, they eat me, and I will surely soon be dead. Jews, put yourself in my situation. My children have no father and no breadwinner, so be merciful like a father to his sons. Be their father." As the speech suggests, when women sought loans, they deployed rhetoric that indeed confirms the importance of this breadwinner model to how loan institutions work. In this case, it was not the woman herself positioning herself as the substitute for a single male breadwinner that this family has lost because of her husband's death. Rather, she's asking the institution, the Free Loan Society, to take on the role of the breadwinner and support her family. I will next move to women who appeared in these sources in other forms. The women that we have encountered in narratives and images up to this point are not just frugal housewives. It should go without saying. They received loans from free loan societies and even worked at these loan institutions. But as I will explore in this section, while women appear frequently in the descriptive archival record of credit cooperatives and of free loan societies, the prescriptive image of them, presented in the pages of the cooperative press, narrows their roles to that of the homemaker. Documents created by credit cooperatives and deposited with the Cooperative Council under the Ministry of Treasury in Warsaw document women's involvement in Jewish credit cooperatives in various ways. The incorporation papers of the Żydowski Bank Ludowy in Łódź included the signatures of multiple women. The Governing Council of the Credit Cooperative Gospodarcza Kas Spółdzielcza in Lwów included a few women in the late 1920s. An appeal to the Cooperative Council filed by the Kasa Dyskontowa in Lipsk included a female signatory. And when Kasa Kredytowa dla Handlu i Przemysłu in Przemysł was liquidated in 1934, a certain Regina Landesmann filed a claim to recoup the money which she was owed by virtue of being one of the cooperative's founding creditors. I cite all of these examples to demonstrate that these collective anecdotes, culled from the pages submitted to the Polish state by credit cooperatives under the purview of the Union of Jewish Cooperative Societies in Poland, to emphasize that women's involvement in these institutions took a variety of forms. One way to test the hypothesis about how women participated in receiving loans from formal credit institutions in Interwar Poland is to, of course, look at lists of loan recipients. Unfortunately, these kinds of records are few and far between in the surviving files of credit cooperatives and free loan societies, most of which survives in the records of the JDC's American Joint Reconstruction Foundation or Landsmannschaften Department. On the screen, you can see 2 such examples, one from the town of Bełchatów and one from Chorodac, both from the late 1930s. Only 10 women appear on the list of 186 people who received a loan from the Free Loan Society in Bełchatów, and only 2 women appear on the list of 46 people who received a loan from the Free Loan Society in Horowitz. Taken together, these suggest that women made up a very small share, maybe 5% of the borrowers from free loan societies. More detailed lists, however, can be found in these collections and provide an opportunity to interrogate a little bit further. When reporting on loans granted from August 1st, 1937 through January 31st, 1938, the Free Loan Society of Khmelnyk provided dates and amounts in addition to the name of the borrower. Of the 364 loans during this period, 48 or 13%, meaning almost 3 times a larger share than in the previous list that we saw, were given to women. If looking specifically at loans taken out on December 30th to buy state-required business licenses to operate their enterprises in the next calendar year, this proportion rises slightly to 16%. Throughout this period, the average size of the loan given to women was 98 zloty, which was just slightly higher than the overall average of 95. I should say that these differences from such a small sample are not statistically significant, and I would need many more examples of such detailed lists to generalize about lending practices and gender. However, it is notable that one woman appears twice on this list, exactly 3 months apart, and took out a loan of the same amount, 200 zloty. This practice would be obscured on the other kinds of lists, which only report the names of borrowers and not each of their loans. But it invites the question as to whether this kind of repeated borrowing meant that loans were not just a resource for emergencies, but part of a long-term economic strategy. My future research agenda includes trying to find more of these lists to provide a more complete picture of how people actually used these credit institutions. Women were not so easy to find as recipients of loans in the records of Jewish credit cooperatives, and cooperative activists themselves noticed the absence of women as a problem. Boris Halpern, who for many years was the director of a prominent credit cooperative in Vilna and edited that bank's published history, from which the photos you see on the screen are taken, published a sketch in the very first issue of the Yiddish language journal Foreign Volk in March 1928. In this sketch, the leader of a fictionalized credit cooperative in a small town asks why women were not involved in his cooperative bank. Women are everywhere, in parliaments, in city and communal administration, in state institutions. Women are doctors, lawyers, engineers, and so on. And in science, art, and literature, are they not represented? But look around and consider, and you will see that the woman is set off from these concerns about tomorrow. The time when women were bound to the home has passed, not because of the struggle for equal rights, but because of the social conditions in which we live, which require all family members to work so that there is a possibility to survive. And if the situation is such that women play such a great role in all areas of political and social life, then where are they among us in cooperatives? Why do we not see them here, where they should be seen, that is, above all, in the cooperative movement? In Halpern's fictionalized sketch, the hardware store owner, Hannah Esther, is immediately nominated to the Council of the Credit Cooperative and elected unanimously. While it's possible that Halpern himself did witness the election of a woman to leadership of a credit cooperative, he, after all, worked as an auditor for the Union of Jewish Cooperative Societies in Poland and traveled throughout the country to examine the books and attend meetings of credit cooperatives. This sketch's inclusion in the very first issue of a Yiddish language journal meant to popularize the idea of cooperation among the Yiddish reading masses of Jewish Eastern Europe attests to the importance of cooperatives to a broader audience and the salience of the question that I asked at the very beginning: where are the women? But this kind of commitment was followed up by answers that are themselves very telling about what credit cooperative activists believed women would find most compelling. Other writings emphasized the need to draw women closer to the cooperative movement, but they did so primarily by addressing women in their roles as wives who oversaw the household, wives and mothers who oversaw the household. Another author who frequently contributed to the cooperative press suggested that giving women equal voting rights by virtue of their role in maintaining the household could give them a reason to come closer to cooperatives. This author also favorably reported on a proposal presented to the International Cooperative Union by Dr. Maria Oresti to reframe cooperatives themselves as unifying families, not unifying individuals. If cooperatives were unions of families, the reasoning went, then women could serve as one of the two representatives of a family. And while Folk republished notes from Dr. Oresti's speech, it is notable that this speech used the language of, quote, husband and wife, defining them as a pair carrying out their economy in partnership rather than primarily as a father-mother pair. In this way, consumption was imagined to link women to cooperation. In Folk, a slogan by the French economist Charles Gide proclaimed that, quote, cooperation wants to remake the world, but it begins with renovating the household economy. Introducing a women's page, as Folk did in early 1931, would seem to be a perfect venue for feeding that interest in cooperation, explaining how these ideals would lead to more economical maintenance of the household economy. But in this section, titled The Women and the Home, women were presented first and foremost as domestic consumers and mothers, not people interested in cooperative ideals. On the screen, you can see this page, as well as my translations of the headlines for each article within it. This page continued for 3 months, and each time it appeared, it featured a section of practical advice, offering solutions to common household problems: a cough, a burn, ink stains, wet shoes, that only required objects already commonly found at home, such as paper, milk, flowers, onions, and sugar. The editors of this journal apparently did not see fit to use these pages to elaborate on ideals of cooperation. Instead, human interest stories and practical advice for the home, it seemed, was what they believed would capture the interest of the imagined female reader and win her over to this project of economic transformation, addressing her first and foremost as a frugal homemaker. I now turn to the children. So in the very same issue of Folk, where a women's page appeared for the first time, a page for children also appeared for the first time. On it, the journal editors serialized a translation of a short story by the non-Jewish Polish writer Juliusz Kadan-Bedrowski, in which the author recounts his childhood experiences with money. The first installment narrates the first time the writer received any money of his own. At the close of this first installment, the young narrator's father has told him that he could spend it on sweets. But you have to wait a month for the second installment, which at its opening opens with the encouragement from the father that if the child were to save his money instead of spending it on sweets, it would continue to grow. This serialized story distills the change that credit cooperatives hope to effect among the younger generation of Jews in Poland. Credit cooperatives hope to teach the value of saving and of solidarity, which in their view relied upon paternal guidance. This was a project by definition restricted to the credit cooperatives and not shared by the free loan societies. Credit cooperatives looked to the future to transform habits, while free loan societies responded to needs in the present. Children emerged central to defining the difference between these two. Promoting an ethos of saving among the Jews of interwar Poland, credit cooperative activists reasoned, had to start with children and had to rely on the actions of men to instruct them. This was, in part, understood to be a result of the First World War, speculation and inflation during the war and in the early post-war years. As the cooperative activist David Gelbard wrote in 1924, quote, "The young generation growing up in the post-war years in a time of falling currency value do not appreciate and understand saving. Now the success of the idea of saving among the young is to a certain degree dependent on the understanding of saving of their fathers." How did the credit cooperatives seek to transform habits of saving? Children were key, and not only in the home, but also in schools. You can see a picture of the youngest cooperators in Poland on the right. Educating children was seen as, quote, "the moment that would serve as the foundation for cooperative work among the Jews of Poland, determining its success or failure," close quote, as the cooperative activist Gelbard proclaimed in 1925. As is clear from this image of a school cooperative, printed in the pages of the main popular journal of the Jewish cooperative movement in Poland, cooperative activists were eager to welcome children into their ranks. In future research, I plan to look more carefully at materials from Jewish schools in Poland, institutions which were outside my purview for the purposes of this research, but many of which supported support from the JDC, to understand how it was not just parents, but also teachers and educational activists who were involved in forming the financial habits of young people. The actual mechanism of saving was a savings book, and I'll take a moment to explain how they worked. One would buy stamps for a set amount between 10 grosze, 10 cents, and 1 zloty, $1. Not in terms of value, just in terms of, that's not the actual exchange rate for the interwar period, but to give a translation for contemporary America. When the booklet was full, it could be redeemed for an amount larger than the sum of the stamps, thus providing earned interest on small amounts of money saved over time. Once or twice a year, importantly, credit cooperatives would also distribute a considerable bonus sum, up to 1,000 zloty, by random drawing from among the completed savings books. Securing these books was framed as an obligation internal to families. Consider the closing remarks in this pamphlet entitled, "The First Savings Booklet, Your Friend." Therefore, in each family, there must be a recipient of a savings booklet. Every Jewish parent should provide such a booklet for themselves and for their children. One should make the young, growing generation accustomed to the eternal blessing of work and savings, and one should strengthen the foundation of the future livelihood of the youth. This is not to say that families were understood to be uniformly in support of these savings practices. A short story in the journal Faden Folk, dedicated to the young girl who won such lottery prize for completing her savings book, valorized the girl's determination to save money that her father gave her from his own meager earnings against her mother's insistence on the need to spend that money to meet their needs today. In another vignette from the journal, two fathers compared how their children took up the lessons about saving. One man's son had saved a few hundred zloty by buying savings stamps rather than trifles when his parents gave him money. The father recounts with pride that his son had suggested using these savings booklets as collateral to secure a loan from the bank. The second man, in response, complained that his son had grown obsessed with saving money. His son had given up on his studies completely and could hardly sleep because he is so eager to strategize on how he can win one of these lottery drawings. Taken together, these stories printed in the cooperative movement press demonstrate the centrality of savings and the importance of fathers, as good cooperators who have internalized the lessons of cooperation, in helping their children save, even as these stories might be ambivalent about the role of mothers or about the extremes to which people can go when they catch the savings bug. Despite of their lack of explicit focus on men, women, and families, Jewish credit cooperatives and free loan societies, as existing institutions that provided loans and as imagined projects of economic self-help, are shot through with matters of gender and kinship. The imagined ideal member of a credit cooperative may have been a male breadwinner, but the construction of worthiness in free loan societies, albeit not as closely tied to gender, was still reliant on that same model. Examining the role of women in Jewish loan granting institutions in interwar Poland provides a glimpse into just how varied the roles women held were, but shows the narrowness of how they were imagined to participate in projects of economic transformation. The value of saving one's money was not a given for the Jews of interwar Poland, especially the youth who had come of age in a time of war and inflation. Rather, it was a habit to be cultivated and a practice to be explained, especially to those children. Discursive strategies by communal activists seeking to promote credit cooperatives and by individuals seeking funds at free loan societies drew on gendered assumptions about the role of men, women, and children within a family. The emphasis on gender, proper conduct, and household or family transformation, I've shown, is a key way that credit cooperatives define themselves against and alongside free loan societies. While my research focuses on Jewish credit cooperatives in interwar Poland, I believe these questions about how gender shapes the practices of lending and borrowing are by no means limited to this community, this time, and this place. I hope to be in conversation with scholars and people who are thinking about these things before the First World War, after the Second World War, and far outside Jewish Eastern Europe. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Elena, for a fascinating lecture. We'll now open the floor to questions. And as mentioned earlier, your microphones are muted. You can send us questions via the Q&A function. And Elena, I see we have a few questions, so I will just start asking them. One question is, what happened to this cooperative as the prospect for the Second World War became closer and closer?
It's a great question, and thank you, Fred Fellman, for posing it. One of the things I noticed while reading through the JDC archives was that the JDC was always aware that these institutions were functioning, but there is a kind of dip in JDC resources being sent to credit cooperatives and free loan societies around the time of the Great Depression, which is perhaps not a surprise when overall financial resources contracted in the United States. Of course, there was going to be fewer funds available to send to Polish Jews for this form of aid. One interesting thing that I found in the archives was that as anti-Jewish violence increased in Poland from sort of the mid-1930s on, and often targeted market stalls, shops, workshops in sort of the town square of Polish towns, Polish small cities, the credit cooperatives and free loan societies of those towns wrote not to the JDC, but directly to people who had emigrated from those towns and had moved to North America, asking them for support. And then the people who receive these letters, say in Cleveland or Detroit, have no idea how to get funds to their brethren in Poland, so they write to the JDC. And it's a way in which the chronology of institutions, the chronology of politics, shapes the way that these institutions functioned, but also really shapes the flow of money into them. So cooperatives were both receiving more funding, but also meeting more demands for loans as the 1930s went on. So thank you for the question.
So we have a question that is, I would say, somewhat related. It is usually assumed that the economic conditions of Jews in Poland gradually worsen in the interwar period. Is this something you find in your sources? And would you say that it eventually led to a reconfiguration of the gender relations you described?
Thank you for this question. Also, thank you, Nicola, for attending. It's a really interesting question about causality and economic change and how gender changes. I hesitate to provide a clear answer right now, but I will say that paying attention to credit cooperatives and free loan societies and the flow of foreign capital to Poland via the JDC helps me see that, yes, economic conditions for Jews in Poland did gradually worsen in the interwar period, but there was also more funding for loans in 1939 than in 1930, which does not at all make up for the greater need for loans, but it is one way in which these institutions, because they were active throughout the interwar period, perhaps helped to serve as a break from utter impoverishment and utter destruction. But I would love to know what you think, and I would love to continue the conversation outside of the Zoom webinar format.
We're going to miss out. I have two related questions. How much, hold on, sorry, the questions are moving fast. How much oversight or even interference was present from the Polish government? Was there any collaboration with non-Jewish cooperative lending organization? And somewhat similarly, was there an interaction between the Polish bureaucracy and the transmission of funds?
Yes, thank you for these questions. Because I'll answer the second question first, and I'll also answer the question from an anonymous attendee about how non-Jewish organizations or non-Jews in general reacted to these organizations, because I see all of them as connected. So the JDC files provide a lot of insight into the negotiations that JDC representatives in Poland and JDC representatives from North America had with the highest levels of the Polish government in order to secure a license to operate the main bank through which funds traveled from New York to cooperatives in Poland. You know, the head of the JDC Reconstruction Department in Europe was sitting down to meet with the Minister of Finance in 1922 for Poland, and the Minister of Finance was himself a member of the nobility, and sort of a figure who represented continuity from the late imperial period. And it wasn't automatic that the JDC would receive a license to operate a bank in Poland. There were many negotiations about in what denomination, would the transfer happen in Polish zloty? Would it happen in US dollars? When the currency changed in Poland, which happened in 1924 from the Polish mark to the zloty, there was another round of negotiations. So the Polish state was very closely active on the main national level in terms of providing loans to the regional banks, much less loans to individual credit cooperatives, much less loans to individual borrowers. I did not find much evidence of Polish state interference. What I did find evidence of was that all of these credit cooperatives at every level, and sometimes free loan societies, depending on how they were registered with local administrations, had to report not just to their regional office of administration, but they also had to file inspections with the main cooperative council in Warsaw. But the inspections were carried out by representatives from the Union of Jewish Cooperative Societies who were not themselves employees of the state. All of this is to say that it's an administratively complicated picture, which I think for the most part worked to the benefits of local institutions who were able to make loans so long as their balance sheets could cover it. But the question about sort of a grassroots non-Jewish response to these loans, I have not found any comprehensive data about this. But as I was looking in the post-war memorial book from Khmelnyk, the town that provided a report of names, amounts, and dates of loans, I did see that the contributors for this memorial book chose to reprint a request for a loan from a non-Jewish Pole to the credit cooperative in the town from the 1930s. So there was clearly usage of these credit institutions that extended beyond the bounds of the Jewish community.
Thank you. Thank you, Elena. I'm going back a little bit up. Do the loan societies list show what the loans were specifically for?
No, I wish they did. It would be a great question. Towards the later 1930s, there were some loans that were given directly by the JDC office in Warsaw, rather than through local cooperatives. And in those cases, there are a lot of details for what the loans are used for. Helping someone who received a certificate as a hairdresser buy all the proper materials, for example, helping an agricultural dairy cooperative buy 2 more cows. It gets that granular, but at that point, it wasn't local credit cooperatives who had been operating for 15 years giving the loans. So they were sort of exceptional by definition. But I hope to be able to find more specific lists of loans in the archives and come back with a different answer to that question.
We have 2 questions a few more questions that I would like to ask, maybe 3 more questions before we go. Okay, and this one, I'm going to have a pronunciation problem. I wonder to what extent you think the traditional institution of the Gemiles Chesed was a model for the modern free loan society, and whether the history of the Gemiles Chesed as an institution rooted in religious life helps explain the fact that it was male-dominated.
Yeah, and thank you, Professor Kuznets, for attending the talk and for posing this question. My sense from reading the documentation of excuse me, institutions that adopted the name Gemilas Chesed was that they saw themselves in radical break with past tradition. They saw past traditional lending practices as too bounded by who knew whom or who lived near whom, whose family had married into who else's family. And so when Gemilas Chesed Casas free loan associations are writing about the history of lending in Jewish tradition, they define themselves as modern. They have account books. They follow dual entry accounting. They have to report to the state in a way that the traditional institutions never had to. I wonder how much of that is their sort of self-fashioning as a new and modern and more trustworthy institution. But it is a really good question that I will continue to think about, to what degree there's also a continuity of membership from credit cooperatives and free loan societies to other institutions that have a longer tradition that isn't defined around a break from tradition, even within the same location. So thank you for the question.
And the other question is, did this credit cooperative work with a network of Jewish folk banks spread across Poland and Lithuania?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Many of these credit cooperatives had a sort of standard name of Volksbank or Bank Ludowy, a national bank, a people's bank. And so the banks that were called Jewish Volksbanks within Poland were very much part of this network. The degree to which the Union for the Union for Jewish Cooperative Societies in Poland collaborated or saw itself as in competition with or learned from the equivalent union in Lithuania is something I have not seen in the sources. But from reading about sort of national minorities and banking broadly in East Central Europe, I know that Lithuania actually had a higher number of banks per capita within the Jewish population than Poland. So I would have to assume that they faced, I don't know, they had different administrative needs or they faced larger demands on their resources, but it's an excellent question. And I wish I knew enough Lithuanian to really dive into it, but I will have to learn from others' scholarship.
And now for a more general question, and I think it's a good question to conclude with, is what surprised you most in your research?
Thank you. It's such a great question. It's the question I always hope I'll be asked. Initially, I was so surprised that that credit cooperatives worked as well as they did. When I started this project, I didn't quite appreciate the difference between credit cooperatives and free loan societies. And I thought to myself, if you could borrow money without paying interest, why would anyone choose to borrow money and pay interest? So borrowing money without interest from the free loan societies or having to pay interest from the credit cooperatives. And then diving into the sources and better understanding how ideas about cooperation, ideas about respectability, are suffused in the sources about the credit cooperatives helps me understand that people might sometimes work against sort of the clear back of the envelope calculation about how much something will cost them when it seems that what they gain is even more valuable. So I also think, just in closing, that's an observation that I made from this particular set of sources about Jewish lending practices in interwar Poland. But I know that anthropologists and sociologists and historians who work on credit and lending and borrowing in other times and places have seen this too. It's not just that people want what is cheapest. There are also all of these less tangible, less financial benefits that come along with membership in an institution, showing the ability to repay a loan with interest that are hard to pin down. So thank you for the question.
Thank you, Elena. This was really very, very interesting. And thank you to our participants for joining us today. I also would like to thank Sarah Chassin for doing this Fellowship and for introducing Elena today and the Miriam Mimi Pasternak-Tobin Public Educational Programming from the JDC Archives, which made this webinar possible. Today's program is part of a JDC Archives webinar series exploring Jewish experience in Poland from World War I to the Holocaust, insights from the JDC Archives. The first 3 programs in the series were recorded and are available on our website if you have missed them. Our next program will take place on Holocaust Remembrance Day on January 27. Katerina Kralova will present her upcoming book, Homecoming: Holocaust Survivors and Greece, 1941-1946. You can register for it via our Facebook page or website. We'll also have included a link in the chat. Please sign up for our e-newsletter if you would like to be added to our mailing list to receive invitation to our upcoming public program. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much for your participation today.